The rain tapped gently against the glass walls of a high-rise apartment in downtown Seattle. Inside, the world was silent, almost too silent for a man whose life had once been filled with laughter, arguments, and the chaotic joy of fatherhood. Michael Carter, CEO of a thriving real estate firm, stood at the window and stared out at the city lights as if they could answer the questions haunting him. The skyline shimmered under the drizzle, but to Michael it looked like a cold constellation of unreachable stars. Behind him, the apartment gleamed with perfection. Polished floors reflected soft lamplight, expensive art lined the walls, and every surface was impeccably clean. It was the kind of home people envied, the kind of place that looked perfect in magazines. Yet there were no toys scattered on the floor, no photographs of family moments, no lingering warmth of a child's presence. On Michael's desk sat a single framed photo of his 8-year-old son, Lucas Carter, taken years ago. Lucas was laughing in the picture, dressed in a bright red superhero hoodie, his cheeks flushed with joy. Michael had looked at that photo every night since the divorce, sometimes with pride, sometimes with unbearable regret. He picked up the frame, running his thumb across the glass. He remembered the last time he had hugged Lucas. The boy had been 5 then, too young to understand why his parents were separating. Michael had knelt down, promising he would always be there for his son, even as Rebecca Collins, his wife at the time, stood behind them with folded arms and an expression Michael could never quite read. Rebecca had been captivating, once a woman with poise and charm, admired by neighbors and friends. But beneath the perfect image, their marriage had crumbled under secrets and betrayals. When the divorce came, she insisted on full custody of Lucas, claiming stability for the boy. Michael, consumed by his growing business and overwhelmed by guilt, had agreed. He told himself that distance was protection, that Lucas deserved peace rather than being caught in the crossfire of their conflicts. Rebecca remarried quickly. Her new husband, Ryan Collins, was a man with a polished smile and firm handshake, a figure the community welcomed without question. From a distance, they appeared to be the perfect family, living in a tidy house in Ashwood, Oregon, a quiet town surrounded by pine forests and winding back roads. At first, Rebecca sent photos of Lucas, regularly pictures of him playing in the yard, painting in class, or blowing out candles on birthday cakes. Those images gave Michael comfort, proof that his son was thriving. But over time, the updates grew less frequent. A few months ago, they stopped entirely. Michael had tried to convince himself there was no cause for alarm. Rebecca was busy. Lucas was busy. Still, unease gnawed at him like a persistent whisper. That night, as he reviewed late-night reports at his sleek glass desk, his laptop chimed. A new email had arrived with no subject line and no sender name. Curious, Michael opened it. The message was brief. "If you love your son, come to Ashwood. Check the backyard." Beneath the words was an attachment, a simple map of a neighborhood he recognized as Rebecca's street. A red X marked a spot behind her house. Michael froze. His first thought was that it must be some kind of mistake or cruel joke, but his gut twisted with a fear he hadn't felt in years. He grabbed his phone and dialed Rebecca's number. It rang 3 times before she answered. Her voice was smooth, almost rehearsed. "Michael, it's late. Why are you calling?" "Where's Lucas?" Michael asked, keeping his tone steady. "I want to talk to him." "He's asleep," she said quickly. "Everything is fine. You're overreacting." From somewhere in the background, Michael heard a man's voice. Ryan's voice. It was sharp, clipped. Then Ryan came on the line. "Lucas is fine," he said coldly. "Stay away from my family, Michael. Don't call again." The line went dead. Michael stood in the center of his perfect empty apartment, his heart pounding. For a moment he considered calling the police in Ashwood, but what would he tell them? A strange email, a father's instinct. They would dismiss him or worse, alert Rebecca and Ryan. He made his decision in an instant. Throwing on his jacket, he grabbed his keys and headed for the garage. The drive to Ashwood took nearly 5 hours through winding, rain-slick roads. The night pressed in on either side of his car, dense with towering pines. As the miles ticked by, Michael's mind replayed every missed visit, every time he'd convinced himself that staying away was an act of love. When he finally crossed into Ashwood, dawn was breaking. The small town was waking slowly. Smoke curling from chimneys' front porches decorated with pumpkins for the fall season. On the surface it looked idyllic, a picture-perfect postcard of American life. Rebecca's house stood at the end of a cul-de-sac, white siding, gleaming flower boxes neatly arranged under the windows. A flag fluttered gently from the porch. Everything about it screamed stability, success, and warmth. But Michael noticed what was missing. There were no bikes leaning against the porch, no toys scattered in the yard, no chalk drawings on the driveway. It was as if no child lived there at all. He parked a block away and walked slowly toward the house. Neighbors watched him from behind curtains, quickly looking away when he caught their gaze. A knot of dread tightened in his chest. Michael circled the side of the house, staying close to the fence line. Behind the house was a small, weathered shed. Its roof sagged slightly, and a chain secured the door. The ground around it was trampled as if someone or something had spent a lot of time there. At first, Michael heard nothing. Then, faintly, a sound reached his ears. A soft, broken sob so quiet he almost thought he imagined it. He froze, listening harder. The sound came again, a muffled whimper followed by silence. Michael's breath caught. He moved to the door and tugged at the chain. It rattled, but held firm. His hands shook as he searched the ground, finally finding a rusted garden tool. With a desperate heave, he pried the chain loose and flung the door open. The smell hit him first, damp wood mildew and something sour that made his stomach lurch. His eyes adjusted to the dim interior, and then he saw him. Lucas. The boy was curled tightly in the far corner, knees drawn to his chest, clutching a small rotting carrot as if it were a treasure. His face was pale, streaked with dirt. His hair hung in limp, unwashed strands. When Lucas lifted his head, his eyes were hollow-shadowed by something no child should ever carry. For a heartbeat, Michael couldn't move. This was not the vibrant little boy from the photographs. This was a child who had been hidden away, neglected. Maybe worse. Lucas. Michael whispered, voice breaking. "It's me. Dad's here." Lucas flinched. He pressed back against the wall, trembling. "Don't hurt me." He choked out his voice so raw it sounded like it had been scraped away by fear. Michael's vision blurred with tears. He wanted to rush forward to hold his son to promise safety, but he forced himself to stay still, hands open and empty. "It's okay," he said softly. "I'm here now." Before Lucas could respond, voices cut through the morning air. Rebecca's sharp tone, Ryan's deeper growl. Footsteps crunched on gravel. Michael spun his body tense, shielding Lucas from view. Rebecca appeared first, her expression shifting from shock to fury in an instant. Ryan loomed behind her, his face unreadable. "What are you doing here?" Rebecca demanded, her voice high and brittle. Michael didn't answer. His entire world had narrowed to the trembling child behind him and the threat standing before him. Die. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel to follow the next chapter and witness what happens next. The motel sat on the edge of Ashwood like an afterthought, a row of doors facing a gravel lot and a narrow slice of pine forest. Michael Carter carried Lucas inside with a care that felt ceremonial, as if any sudden movement might shatter the boy like glass. The room was small. 2 beds with patterned spreads, a humming mini-fridge, a table by the window, and it smelled faintly of detergent and rain-soaked carpet. He closed the door softly and set Lucas on the nearer bed. Lucas recoiled to the headboard, knees drawn and eyes watchful. He said nothing. Michael didn't ask him to. The boy's silence was not empty. It was full of 1,000 unsaid things, crowded with a vocabulary of flinches and pauses that told stories more honestly than words. Michael moved slowly, narrating quiet actions more for comfort than comprehension. He filled a cup with water from the bathroom sink and placed it on the nightstand. He found a blanket in the closet and draped it over the bed like a shield. He turned the heat up 2 degrees. In the window's reflection, he saw a man he barely recognized, tired-eyed, jaw-tight shoulders, stooped with the weight of a choice that should never have been deferred. He sat in the chair by the table, hands folded, as if he were keeping vigil. Every few minutes, Lucas's breath stuttered as though night itself were a place he did not trust. When the boy finally drifted into a light, uneasy sleep, Michael emailed the only people he could think to trust. Daniel Reed, his oldest friend and attorney Valerie Stone, whose name Daniel had texted 5 minutes after hearing what Michael had found in the shed. By sunrise, Valerie had replied with the efficiency of someone accustomed to emergencies. She wanted locations, photos, a summary of what Michael had seen. She wrote in clean lines and clear tasks: document injuries without invasive detail, acquire immediate medical evaluation, do not engage Rebecca or Ryan, directly contact CPS after evidence is secured. The order of operations read like a staircase he could climb one disciplined step at a time. Michael glanced at Lucas and measured the narrow distance between care and intrusion. He left the boy sleeping while he drove to a 24-hour pharmacy for basic supplies, nutrient shakes, gentle soap, a soft toothbrush, unscented lotion, a small stuffed orca, whose stitched smile felt like a promise that better things existed in the world. On his way back, he stopped at an urgent care clinic. He spoke to the nurse at the counter with the restrained urgency of a man who could not afford to be turned away. He used the words evaluation, safety, documentation, and avoided words that might ignite systems too quickly, too loudly, before he had a net strong enough to hold. Back in the room, he knelt at arm's length. He set the bag on the floor, one item at a time, letting Lucas see everything before it crossed the space between them. The boy's gaze lingered on the orca. Michael left it there without comment. A minute passed. Then a small hand slid forward, and the orca was gone beneath the blanket tucked to the boy's chest as though it had always belonged there. That afternoon, Michael drove them to a clinic 2 towns over where no receptionist knew Rebecca by name and no nurse would call a neighbor between check-ins. A pediatrician with steady eyes and a voice made for reassurance examined Lucas gently, leaving long pauses narrating each step. She recorded what she could see without prying at what she could not. She gave Michael a folder, pages stamped and signed, details noted in the careful language of mandated reporting. He thanked her with the quiet gratitude of a drowning man handed a rope. By evening, Valerie had connected him to a social worker at Child Protective Services. The conversation unfolded like a dance across a thin wire. The social worker listened, asked for dates and times, requested copies of photos, and the medical summary spoke of assessment windows and temporary placement considerations. Her caution was not indifference. It was structure. She explained what the agency could do and what it could not do yet. Evidence mattered. Consistency mattered. A narrative was one thing. A case was another. Michael understood. He did not need a lecture on foundations. His life had been built on permits and plans and the slow, exacting work of bringing steel and glass into alignment. He would build this too. He would build it right. He drove after dusk to the quiet house next door to Rebecca's, a small, blue bungalow, with a porch crowded by potted ferns and wind chimes that whispered to the night. He knocked, then stepped back, palms visible. After a moment, the door opened a cautious inch. Mrs. Harriet Miller peered out, a trim woman in her 70s with snow-white hair and the wary posture of someone who had spent years surviving politely. Michael introduced himself and asked if they could talk on the porch. He spoke softly, not naming the worst part, simply asking whether she had heard anything unusual at night. Harriet kept her eyes on the street as if eavesdroppers hid in the azaleas. She did not answer immediately. She asked for a minute, then returned wearing a cardigan despite the relative warmth. She sat, hands folded. Her voice, when it came, was hushed. She had heard sounds, yes, small, stifled cries that threaded through the dark like a radio station caught between frequencies. She had told herself it was a raccoon, or a stray dog, or the wind wrestling the siding. She had told herself it was not her business, and then she had prayed for forgiveness for telling herself that. Michael listened without correction or blame. He did not need to hear her apology. He needed her courage. He asked, after a long pause, whether he might place a small camera on her property pointing toward the shed. It would be discreet. It would be temporary. It might be the difference between doubt and proof. Harriet did not answer right away. Her gaze drifted to the house next door, its porch light bright, its flag stirring as if restless. She nodded once, the kind of nod people make when they choose to be braver than they were yesterday. The following morning, before first light, Michael returned with 2 motion-activated cameras small enough to hide in the porch ferns. He placed one under the eave with a view of the backyard and another near the fence line where ivy and lattice made a good disguise. He tested the angles on his phone, adjusted, tested again, then left the frame blank as dawn rose like a pale admission across the roofs. He did not sleep. He watched. In the motel, Lucas dozed in short, fragile stretches, waking to drink water to hold the orca closer to stare at the wall, as though the paint were a map he could read if he concentrated hard enough. Michael narrated the day in murmurs. This is breakfast. This is the sound of a shower running. This is the way a door opens when no one is angry. Just after 5, the following morning, the first camera notified him of the motion. He sat up, breath held, as the screen bloomed into the gray-blue of pre-dawn. A figure crossed the yard with efficient strides, Ryan Collins. He moved to the shed, unlocked it, and bent out of frame. A moment later, Lucas appeared, led by the wrist. There was no shouting on the recording, only the brittle quiet of instructions delivered like weather advisories. Ryan pointed toward a wooden spoon left on a crate, shook it once, then set it down as if its mere existence were enough. He guided Lucas back inside and relocked the door. Michael felt something inside him settle not into calm, but into certainty. He clipped the file, saved local copies, uploaded one to a secure drive, sent another to Valerie with timestamps and a subject line that read, "Only confirmed." The next day delivered more of the same brief visits, perfunctory trays, a pattern of presence without care. Rebecca appeared once in a cardigan and slippers, hair gathered as if she had not slept. She placed a bottle of water and 2 slices of bread outside the door and tapped twice with her knuckles. Then she left. The door did not open. Minutes later, small fingers reached through the gap to drag the tray inward. The footage twisted at Michael's chest like a hand. He organized it anyway, labels, dates, a ledger of neglect, and sent it to Valerie, who forwarded it to the social worker with the kind of professional restraint that made things happen. A motion would be filed, a visit would be scheduled. The machine was moving. Then the machine stuttered. Late that afternoon, the camera feed went black. A moment later, the second camera followed it into silence. Michael stared at the buffering icon as if willpower alone could reverse a severed wire. He drove to Harriet's with a pocket full of apologies and a toolkit he barely felt in his hands. Harriet opened the door before he reached the steps. She looked smaller than she had yesterday, as if fear were a coat heavier than she was built to wear. She had found one of the cameras on the ground, face crushed. A man had been in her yard, she said, though she had not seen his face, only a jacket, a shape moving quickly, the low scrape of a curse against his teeth. She had locked her doors after that. She had sat in her living room with the television on mute and the lights off, listening to her heart keep unreliable time. Michael apologized again and meant it. He checked the eaves, the fence line, the ivy. The cameras were done. He would have to rely on what he had already gathered and hope it was enough to withstand scrutiny. That night, the motel room felt smaller. Lucas curled around the orca, eyes open in the dark. Michael sat at the table writing a chronology on hotel stationery, printing files at the front desk, numbering exhibits in a private language of preparation. He sent copies to Valerie and Daniel. He sent a brief note to the CPS social worker with a sober subject line and attached summaries. He reminded himself that momentum could be reassembled like scaffolding after wind. At 3 a.m, exhaustion won a narrow vote. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the room was blue with early light, and Lucas had slipped from the bed to sit cross-legged on the carpet back against the wall, the orca tucked beneath his arm like a secret. He wasn't crying, he wasn't speaking, he was waiting. Michael understood the assignment the moment he saw him make morning safer than night, make the next hour safer than the last. He brewed motel coffee, a bitter medicine for the day, and thought of the steps ahead: CPS interviews, legal filings, the risk of Rebecca's public charm, and Ryan's quiet menace. He thought of the neighbors' curtains, the way they lifted and fell like breaths held and released. He thought of Harriet's nod, small and brave, and the way courage sometimes had to leave to find its way back. When his phone buzzed, the message was from Valerie. "We're moving." The petition would be filed that afternoon. The social worker had approved a same-day welfare check with law enforcement present. The plan would be quiet, correct, professional, no sirens, no spectacle, only process stepping exactly where it was designed to step. Michael exhaled. The day would be long. He packed the folder, zipped the drives into an inner pocket, and tidied the room so it looked like a place that had held care. He helped Lucas into a clean sweatshirt and laced small sneakers with a patience that felt like prayer. By noon, clouds had thinned to a high, indifferent brightness. Michael parked 2 streets over from Rebecca's with instructions to remain out of view. He watched the minute hand lurch forward, then halt, then lurch again, as it always does when watched too hard. He watched the street quiet itself into the kind of stillness that announces change. In the distance, 2 cruisers turned the corner without lights. A gray sedan followed. The figures who stepped out wore ordinary clothes and carried clipboards, which is how serious things often arrive. Michael rested his forehead on the steering wheel for 1 heartbeat, then looked up. Somewhere behind that white siding, a boy had learned to mistake silence for safety. Somewhere in that yard, a door would open. Somewhere in the shadow of a shed, a life would shift. The day held its breath. The day of the visit dawned cold and clear, the kind of autumn morning that looked harmless on the surface. Leaves drifted across quiet streets. Neighbors swept porches, and the air carried a crispness that belonged to ordinary life. From the outside, Rebecca Collins's house looked like any other in Ashwood white siding, gleaming pumpkins arranged neatly by the steps, a flag moving gently in the breeze. But Michael Carter knew better now. Beneath the surface of painted shutters and trimmed hedges, cruelty had been cultivated in silence. Somewhere inside that yard, his son waited. He sat in his car 2 blocks away, parked beneath the shadow of a pine tree. Beside him on the passenger seat lay a folder with carefully numbered pages, a thumb drive containing video footage, and a copy of the medical report. These were his weapons, in a battle fought not with fists, but with proof. Time moved strangely as he waited. Each second stretched, then collapsed. He watched the street, the children riding bikes, the curtains lifting briefly in windows, the world pretending it did not know what he had seen. Then, at precisely noon, 2 police cruisers turned onto the street. Their lights were off, engines quiet. A gray sedan followed. From it emerged 2 representatives of Child Protective Services, their clipboards held like shields. The plan was deliberate. There would be no spectacle, no sirens, only quiet authority stepping carefully through the morning. Michael did not follow them immediately. He stayed back as instructed, hands gripping the wheel until his knuckles blanched. This was their part to play, not his. If he rushed forward, he could destroy everything they had built. In the yard ahead, the timing was almost surreal. Rebecca had chosen that exact day to host a first birthday party for her infant daughter with Ryan. The front lawn was dotted with pastel balloons and white folding chairs. A long table displayed cupcakes, sandwiches, and punch-in glass bowls. Laughter floated into the air like confetti. Rebecca moved among the guests in a flowing, cream-colored dress, her hair perfect, her smile luminous. Ryan stood near the grill, passing plates and shaking hands. To anyone looking on, they were the portrait of a thriving young family. The yard radiated charm and prosperity. Michael watched from a distance, his stomach tightening. Behind that tableau of perfection, only 30 feet away stood the small, weathered shed. It was partly hidden by trash bins and an old tarp, as if trying to vanish into the shadows. No one looked in that direction. No one acknowledged what lay beyond the balloons and laughter. The officers and CPS workers approached, calmly moving through the party as though attending another neighborhood gathering. At first, no one noticed. Rebecca raised a glass of punch and began a story about her daughter's first steps. Cameras flashed, applause rose. Then a clear voice cut through the celebration. "Mrs. Collins! Mr. Collins! We need to inspect the rear structures of this property." The words fell like stones into the shallow pool of polite noise. Guests turned their smiles faltering. Rebecca's laugh stopped mid-breath. She blinked rapidly, her composure slipping for a fraction of a second. "This is a private event," she began, her voice strained but still soft. The lead officer held up a badge expression neutral. "We have legal authority to proceed." Michael's pulse thundered in his ears. He left the car and walked slowly toward the house, staying at the perimeter as Valerie had instructed. His feet felt heavier than stone. The officer disappeared behind the house, flanked by a CPS representative. The party fell into an unnatural hush. Guests shifted uncomfortably torn between curiosity and fear of implication. Then came the sound Michael had been waiting for, the metallic rattle of a chain followed by a sharp intake of breath. A moment later, the officer emerged carrying a small figure. Lucas. He was thinner than Michael remembered, his clothes hanging awkwardly on his frame. His face was pale lips, cracked hair matted, but his eyes were open. Wide and blinking against the sudden light, they searched the yard, then found Michael. The boy's mouth didn't form words, but Michael understood. He crossed the remaining distance, reaching out carefully. Lucas leaned forward into his arms without hesitation. The weight was fragile, almost nothing, but to Michael it was everything. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone dropped a glass, a neighbor whispered. Rebecca stumbled forward, her voice breaking now. "He's my son. You can't take him." The CPS representative's tone was calm, clinical. "Effective immediately. Lucas Carter is placed under emergency protective custody." Ryan's face hardened. He took a step as if to intervene, but two officers moved subtly into his path. The party dissolved into chaos. Guests murmured, avoided Rebecca's gaze, gathered children, and left quickly. Within minutes, the carefully staged image of a perfect life had unraveled. Michael held Lucas close, shielding him from the stares, the questions, the fragments of judgment. He felt the boy's small hands clutching his shirt, not in fear now, but with the first flicker of trust. Behind them, Rebecca's sobs turned to sharp, angry pleas. Ryan's voice rose defensive-aggressive, then fell into silence as the reality of authority settled over him like a closing door. Michael did not look back. He carried Lucas past the gate, past the scattered balloons, and overturned cups past the illusion of safety. He placed his son gently in the back seat of the gray sedan where a CPS worker waited. Lucas kept his gaze on Michael until the last second, as if afraid his father might vanish like a dream. When Michael finally stepped aside, the air tasted different. Lighter, sharper, threaded with the fragile possibility of change. He knew this was not the end. It was only a pause between storms, the moment in which hope was visible but not yet secure. Rebecca and Ryan would not surrender easily. They had built their lives on appearances, and appearances did not collapse without resistance. Still, for this brief, suspended moment, Lucas was free. Michael closed his eyes and let himself breathe just once as a father and not a strategist. Tick. Stay with us by subscribing to never miss the truth behind the next storm. The days that followed the rescue unfolded like a dream wrapped in fog. Part real, part imagined, all fragile. Michael Carter stayed close to Lucas, moving carefully through the hours as if each one were made of glass. The boy slept in brief, fractured intervals, waking with a start at the sound of footsteps in the hallway or a door closing too quickly. Michael's life became a quiet routine of tending to those fears, offering stability in small, deliberate gestures. A warm blanket, a nightlight glowing softly in the corner, a voice that never rose above a whisper. For the first time in years, Michael allowed himself to believe they were safe. But safety has a way of disappearing the moment you name it. 2 days after the intervention, the first news segment aired. Michael saw it by accident, a muted television playing in the corner of a gas station as he bought coffee. The images hit him like cold water. Rebecca sat beneath studio lights, hairstyled in gentle waves, makeup flawless. She held a tissue delicately as if even her sorrow had been curated. Ryan sat beside her, posture protective, hand resting on hers. They were the very image of respectable parents under siege. The anchor's voice carried over footage of balloons and cupcakes from the birthday party, but the narrative had been rewritten. According to Rebecca, Lucas had been dealing with behavioral challenges since early childhood. The shed, she claimed, had been a temporary solution, a quiet space for him to calm himself, never a punishment. Ryan nodded solemnly, speaking of his love for Lucas as if he were my own. When the interview ended, the anchor turned to the camera with practiced sympathy, urging viewers to withhold judgment until all facts were known. Michael stood frozen, paper cup trembling in his hand. Around him, other customers glanced at the screen, their expressions conflicted. The story had shifted. Public opinion was no longer on his side. By the time he reached the motel, social media had erupted. Comment sections overflowed with speculation and anger. Some people believed Rebecca's version of events, painting Michael as a distant father who had suddenly appeared to disrupt a stable home. Others defended him fiercely, citing the CPS intervention as proof of wrongdoing. The town itself seemed to split down invisible lines. Neighbors who had turned away in silence now turned on each other. Those who had attended the birthday party whispered that they had seen nothing unusual. Others claimed they had always suspected something, but hadn't wanted to interfere. Valerie Stone, ever composed, called Michael that evening. Her voice was clipped but steady. "Rebecca and Ryan are mounting a counteroffensive," she said. "They've hired a public relations firm. Expect more interviews, more statements. They're trying to reframe the narrative before the custody hearing." Michael understood the strategy. He had seen similar tactics in business control, the story control the outcome. But this wasn't about markets or mergers. This was about his son. Lucas sat on the bed nearby, coloring quietly. He didn't look up when Michael spoke to Valerie, but his hand tightened on the crayon each time a name was mentioned. Valerie outlined the next steps. They needed more than emotion. They needed irrefutable evidence, something no spin doctor could twist. Michael thought of the footage he had lost when Ryan destroyed the cameras. It might not be enough. That night, sleep refused to come. Michael sat by the window watching headlights trace paths across the parking lot. He thought of Harriet Miller, her quiet nod of courage when she first agreed to help, and the fear that had sent her fleeing after Ryan's threat. She had been his strongest witness. Without her, their case felt hollow. At dawn, a knock sounded at the door. Michael opened it to find Harriet standing there, her cardigan buttoned unevenly, her hands trembling around a file folder. "I couldn't stay away," she said simply. She came inside and sat heavily in the chair by the table. Her eyes were red-rimmed but resolute. Harriet explained that before leaving town she had backed up the camera footage onto a separate drive, a precaution born of decades of mistrust. She placed the drive on the table like an offering. "I saw what they did to that boy," she said, voice breaking, "and I'll tell the court myself if I have to." No more silence. Michael felt the weight in his chest shift, not vanish, but transform into something sharper, hope edged with fury. Valerie arrived within the hour. She reviewed the files, her expression unreadable, then gave a single decisive nod. This was the leverage they needed. Combined with the medical report and CPS documentation, it would create a wall of truth too high for Rebecca's lies to scale. News of Harriet's return spread quickly. Within a day, the tone of online commentary began to change. Screenshots of the footage circulated quietly at first, then surged into the public sphere. Outrage replaced doubt. The perfect facade Rebecca had built cracked under the weight of undeniable images, Ryan dragging Lucas by the wrist, trays of food left outside the shed like offerings to a captive animal, Rebecca turning away instead of intervening. Rebecca responded with another interview, this one more desperate. She spoke of misunderstandings of context stripped away. But the tide had shifted. Her words sounded hollow now, rehearsed against the backdrop of visible harm. Michael did not celebrate. Public opinion was a storm, powerful, unpredictable, and easily redirected. He focused on the task ahead, preparing for the custody hearing. This would be the true battleground where appearances would matter less than facts. Valerie guided him through every step. They built timelines, reviewed transcripts, rehearsed statements. Lucas would not testify directly. His voice would be protected. But Harriet would stand beside them, her testimony reinforced by the footage she had saved. As the hearing drew near, tension wrapped the motel like fog. Michael barely left the room except to meet with Valerie and Daniel. Lucas clung to routines coloring quiet walks at dawn, simple meals eaten in companionable silence. Trust was a fragile thing, rebuilt grain by grain. On the morning of the hearing, Michael dressed carefully, choosing a navy suit and a tie Lucas had once tugged on playfully when he was a toddler. He looked in the mirror and saw not a CEO or a strategist, but a father preparing for battle. Outside clouds gathered heavy and unbroken. The air felt charged as if the entire town were holding its breath. Michael took Lucas's hand and whispered a silent vow, no more distance, no more delay. Whatever storm awaited them in that courtroom, they would face it together. The courthouse loomed like a monument to judgment, its pale stone facade stark against a sky the color of pewter. Rain streaked the windows, a steady curtain that blurred the edges of the world. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation, every cough and shuffle amplified by the hush of expectation. For Michael Carter, each step through those corridors felt heavier than the last. He moved with measured precision, guided by Valerie Stone and Daniel Reed, his allies, in this final confrontation. Beside him, Lucas clutched his small orca toy, the same one Michael had bought at a pharmacy during those first desperate hours of freedom. The boy's grip was steady now, not from fear, but from a fragile sense of grounding. Michael whispered a silent promise: no matter what happened here, Lucas would never be alone again. The courtroom itself was smaller than Michael had imagined, yet it seemed vast the moment they entered. Rows of wooden benches stretched toward the judge's bench where Judge Harris, a man with graying hair and eyes sharpened by decades of decisions, waited with quiet authority. On the opposing side, Rebecca Collins sat rigidly, hands clasped so tightly they blanched white. Her composure was deliberate, the same flawless image she had presented to television cameras. Beside her, Ryan Collins sat like a shadow. Given form, his jaw clenched, his gaze fixed on some private point of fury. The case began with the precision of ritual. Statements were read, evidence entered into the record. Michael watched silent as the narrative of his son's suffering unfolded in the sterile language of legal procedure. The medical report was introduced first, bruises, catalogued malnutrition, noted psychological trauma, outlined in clinical terms that stripped the pain down to data. Then came the footage Harriet had saved, displayed on a monitor for the room to see. The images needed no explanation. Ryan dragging Lucas by the wrist. Trays of food left outside the shed like offerings to something unworthy of care. Rebecca turning away, her posture stiff with indifference. The room held its breath. Even Judge Harris, who had likely seen horrors of every kind, shifted in his seat. When Harriet took the stand, her voice trembled but did not falter. She spoke of the nights she had heard Lucas cry, of the excuses she had told herself to justify her silence, of the moment she realized that inaction was complicity. Her confession was not just testimony. It was a reckoning. By the time she stepped down, there were tears on more than one face in the gallery. Rebecca's attorney countered with polished arguments and rehearsed charm. She painted Michael as an absent father motivated by guilt and control, a man who had abandoned his family only to return when it suited him. She produced a carefully edited video clip that seemed to show Michael shouting at a much younger Lucas, his hands raised in anger. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. For a heartbeat, Michael felt the ground tilt beneath him. It was a calculated blow meant to poison the air with doubt, but Valerie was ready. With calm precision, she produced the unedited footage. The truth played out before them, not rage, but a moment of protection. Michael scooping Lucas up to shield him from falling debris during a renovation visit. The lie collapsed under its own weight. Judge Harris's gaze moved between the two tables, his expression unreadable. When Rebecca was called to speak, she hesitated, then walked slowly to the stand. Her words were halting at first, then poured forth in a stream of justification and denial. She spoke of exhaustion, of feeling overwhelmed, of Ryan's reassurances that this was temporary. She admitted to locking Lucas away, but framed it as discipline, as structure, as something misunderstood by outsiders. Michael listened without expression. Every syllable was another stone placed on the wall between them. When Ryan took the stand, his voice was cold and deliberate. He claimed Lucas was ungrateful, difficult, a disruptive presence in a home that should have been peaceful. He did not see a child. He saw only an obstacle. When it was Michael's turn, he rose slowly, his movements controlled but resonant with suppressed emotion. He did not speak of revenge or hatred. He spoke of absence of the guilt that had driven him to believe that staying away was a form of love. He spoke of the moment he found Lucas in that shed and how the boy's silence had been louder than any scream. "I don't want to punish them," he said finally, his voice breaking. "I just want my son to be safe." Silence followed. Then Judge Harris leaned forward, hands clasped. "This court," he said, each word deliberate, "finds in favor of Mr. Carter. Full custody of Lucas Carter is hereby granted to his father effective immediately." Rebecca gasped, reaching instinctively toward Lucas. But the boy pressed closer to Michael without hesitation, his small fingers gripping his father's sleeve. It wasn't fear that moved him, but choice. The judge continued suspending Rebecca's visitation rights and referring Ryan's conduct to law enforcement. The gavel fell with a sharp finality that seemed to echo for miles. Outside the courthouse, the rain had stopped. The sky was pale and open as if the world itself had exhaled. Michael and Lucas walked down the steps hand in hand, passing reporters and cameras that now watched in silence. They did not answer questions. This was not a story for spectacle. It was a story for healing. In the weeks that followed, Michael and Lucas built a new rhythm. Their days were quiet but rich with meaning. Breakfasts shared without hurry, walks through the park. Bedtime stories whispered in the soft glow of a lamp. Lucas began to speak more, his words halting at first, then flowing with the ease of trust. He still checked the locks at night, still startled at sudden noises, but those reflexes softened as safety became not just a promise, but a lived reality. One evening, Lucas sat at the kitchen table with a notebook. He wrote slowly, his small hand steady. When he finished, he slid the page to Michael. It was a letter. "To the people who didn't see me, I forgive you. Maybe you didn't look hard enough. Maybe you looked away because it was easier. But I hope you look again for the next kid. I'm still here, and I'm not afraid of the light anymore." Michael read the words through a blur of tears. With Lucas's permission, the letter was shared at a local education conference, then published online. It traveled far beyond Ashwood, becoming a quiet anthem for awareness and action. Teachers, neighbors, and parents began to look more closely, to listen more carefully. Change spread not in shouts, but in ripples. Months later, father and son visited the aquarium. Lucas stood before a tank filled with penguins, his face illuminated by the blue glow of the water. He reached for Michael's hand and said softly, "We belong here now, don't we?" Michael knelt beside him. "Yes," he whispered, "we do." As they left the building, the sun broke through the clouds, scattering light across the wet pavement. Lucas looked at their shadows stretching ahead and smiled. "They're not scary anymore," he said, "because now I know the light is behind us." Michael lifted his son into his arms and turned toward home, each step carrying them further from darkness and closer to a future they had fought to claim. Ade. Subscribe now to hear more stories of hope, survival, and courage. Your support helps bring these voices into the light.